James never considered himself ordinary. A thrill-seeker by nature, his life had always been a series of wild leaps into the unknown. But no amount of skydiving, deep-sea diving, or near-death escapes could have prepared him for this. It began with a quiet walk along the beach, the waves lapping at his feet under the warm glow of a setting sun. He'd sought solitude that evening, the crash of the tide soothing the relentless noise in his mind. And then it came a sharp hum, almost melodic, but charged with energy that prickled his skin. Before he could look up, a beam of blinding light shot from the sky, enveloping him in a cocoon of warmth and power. The beach dissolved into nothingness, replaced by an arena that defied the laws of physics. Its walls shimmered with iridescent colors, alive and pulsating. An unseen crowd roared, their alien voices reverberating through his bones. A deep, commanding voice boomed from the heavens. "Earthling, you have been chosen. Stand as the champion of Warrior Rosie in the tournament of an area. Together, you shall fight for survival, honor, and the bond eternal." "What?" James muttered, barely able to process the words, before another voice cut through the chaos, a sharp, assertive tone that froze him mid-thought. "Turn around, human," the voice said. "Let me see what I'm working with." James spun, his breath catching. Before him stood a vision out of a fever dream. Her skin was a luminous blue, her body carved with the precision of an artist's masterpiece. Silky pink hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face as fierce as it was beautiful. Sapphire eyes locked onto him, sharp and unyielding. "Rosie," she said, her full lips curving into a half-smile that was more challenge than greeting. "You're the one fate brought me. I'd expected someone taller." James blinked, his mind racing to catch up. "You must be joking." Her smile widened slightly. "I don't joke when my life's on the line, and neither should you." Before he could reply, the arena trembled. Platforms rose from the ground, spires of flame erupting between them. A low growl echoed through the air, and two hulking creatures lumbered into view. Their spiked armor glinted ominously, and their glowing red eyes radiated malice. "Focus!" Rosie snapped. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen carefully, Earthling. Stay close to me and don't slow me down." James yanked his arm free, his pulse pounding. "I don't do slow, and I don't take orders. Let's see if you can keep up with me." Her sapphire eyes narrowed, but a flicker of amusement danced in their depths. "Fine. Don't die, and maybe I'll reconsider my first impression." The creatures roared, charging toward them. Rosie moved like liquid fire, her blades slicing through the air with lethal precision. James gritted his teeth, hefting the unfamiliar weapon that had appeared in his hand, an axe, its edge glowing faintly. Adrenaline surged as he swung, the blade connecting with satisfying force. The fight was chaos, every movement a battle for survival. Rosie was a whirlwind of power and grace, her strikes calculated and devastating. James matched her ferocity with raw determination, his body responding instinctively to the rhythm of battle. Together, they were an unrelenting force, each move complementing the others. When the final brute collapsed, Rosie turned to him, her chest heaving with exertion. A trickle of blue blood marked her cheek, but she wiped it away with a confident flick of her hand. "You're better than I expected," she admitted begrudgingly. "And you're terrifying," James replied, his breath ragged but steady. "In a good way." Her lips twitched into a smirk. "Don't get comfortable, human. This was only the first round." The arena shifted again, the platforms sinking back into the ground. The crowd roared their approval as the shimmering walls opened to reveal a narrow corridor. Rosie gestured for him to follow, her stride purposeful. "Where are we going?" James asked, struggling to keep up with her pace. "To prepare for the next fight," she said over her shoulder, "and to talk about the bond eternal. If we're going to survive, you need to understand what's at stake." James swallowed hard, his mind spinning. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, and something told him this was only the beginning. James followed Rosie through the twisting corridor, his mind grappling with the surreal events unfolding around him. The adrenaline from the battle ebbed, replaced by a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. He'd faced danger countless times before, but nothing quite like this. The stakes weren't just his life, they were tied to hers, too. The corridor opened into a private chamber, bathed in soft, bluish light. The walls glowed faintly, displaying swirling patterns that seemed alive, shifting and dancing like underwater currents. Rosie moved to the center of the room, her movements still fluid despite the battle they'd just endured. Sit, she commanded, gesturing to a sleek, curved bench against the wall. James hesitated, but the unspoken authority in her gaze left him little choice. He sank onto the bench, his hands gripping its cool surface. Rosie remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "All right, Rosie," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What's this bond eternal you keep talking about? And why does it sound like I just signed up for something I don't understand?" Her expression softened, just a fraction, and she sighed. "Because you did. That's not exactly comforting," James muttered. She approached him slowly, her steps deliberate. When she stopped, she was close enough that he could see the faint shimmer of her skin in the glowing light. "The bond eternal is more than a title or a victory prize," she began. "It's a sacred connection between two beings, forged through combat, trust, and something deeper." James leaned back slightly, his pulse quickening. "Deeper? What's that supposed to mean?" Her gaze didn't waver. "It means that if we win, our lives will be bound together in every way. Mind, body, soul. It's not just a partnership, it's forever." The weight of her words hit him like a sledgehammer. He forced a laugh, though it came out hollow. "You're kidding, right? Forever sounds a bit extreme." "It's no joke," she said sharply, her voice cutting through his attempt to mask his discomfort. "The bond isn't something to fear. It's revered in my world, a connection stronger than anything your kind could understand." "Right," James said, running a hand through his blonde hair. "Because nothing says strong connection like being zapped off a beach and thrown into an alien death match." Rosie's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're scared." He opened his mouth to deny it, but the truth was lodged too firmly in his throat. Instead, he stood, trying to shake off the tightness in his chest. "I'm not scared," he said, though his voice betrayed him with a slight tremor. "I just wasn't expecting to have my life mapped out for me by a glowing arena and a warrior princess." Her expression softened further, the sharp edges of her demeanor easing into something almost... "James," she said, her voice quieter now, "I didn't choose you to frighten you. I chose you because I believe in you." He blinked, caught off guard. "You believe in me?" "We've known each other for about 5 minutes. Time isn't what matters," she said, taking a step closer. "What matters is what I saw in you the moment you arrived. Strength, resilience, passion. These are the traits that make a champion and a partner." Her words hung in the air, and James felt an unfamiliar warmth rising in his chest. He wanted to believe her, but doubt still gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. "And what if I can't do this?" he asked quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "What if I fail you?" Rosie reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through him that left him breathless. "You won't fail," she said firmly, "because I won't let you, and because, whether you realize it or not, you're already stronger than you think." James looked up, meeting her eyes. For a moment, the weight of his fear lessened, replaced by a flicker of hope. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'll trust you, but I have one condition." She arched a brow. "Oh? And what's that?" "If we're in this forever, I need to know you're not just using me to win some sacred tournament," he said, his tone serious. "I need to know you trust me too." Rosie's gaze softened again, and this time, her smile was genuine. "Trust isn't given, it's earned. But you've already taken the first step. Let's see if you can take the next." Before James could respond, the chamber vibrated with the familiar hum of the arena's power. Rosie turned toward the doorway, her expression hardening. "Another challenge is coming. Stay close, Earthling. And remember what I said, trust me." As the walls began to shift and the chamber dissolved into another battlefield, James squared his shoulders. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, he wasn't facing it alone. The world around them reformed with dizzying speed, leaving James momentarily disoriented. The chamber's soft glow gave way to a suffocating darkness pierced by sharp, pulsing lights that outlined jagged, shifting walls. A humid wind brushed his face, carrying with it the acrid tang of something primal and dangerous. "What now?" James muttered, gripping the handle of his axe. He felt Rosie's presence close beside him, her movements purposeful as she scanned the labyrinthine arena. "This," she said, her tone clipped and focused, "is the maze of fangs. It's a living labyrinth, designed to test our cohesion." James took a cautious step forward, the ground beneath him squelching ominously. "Living? What does that mean?" Rosie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt, pressing her hand against the ground. The faint light of the maze reflected off her blue skin, making her look both ethereal and fearsome. It means the maze will try to kill us. As if to punctuate her words, a low growl rumbled through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of something massive slithering in the distance. James felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Great. Of course, it's trying to kill us. Why wouldn't it? Rosie rose smoothly, her blade shimmering as it extended from a hilt on her belt. Stay close. The maze shifts constantly, and if we get separated, it won't just be the creatures you'll have to worry about. James nodded, swallowing hard. His fear was a constant thrum now, but he buried it under a mask of determination. If Rosie could face this with such calm, then so could he, or so he hoped. The two moved cautiously through the twisting passages, the walls pulsating like a heartbeat. The maze seemed to react to their presence, closing paths behind them and opening new ones ahead. It was alive, just as Rosie had said, and its intent was far from benevolent. They hadn't gone far when the first attack came. Without warning, the ground beneath them shifted, and a massive set of jaws erupted from the floor. James barely had time to react, yanking Rosie back as the fangs snapped shut where she'd been standing. "Thanks," she said breathlessly, her sapphire eyes wide with surprise. "Don't mention it," James replied, his grip on his axe tightening. The creature slithered fully into view, a grotesque amalgamation of scales, claws, and venom-dripping fangs. Its serpentine body coiled, and its slit pupil eyes locked onto them with predatory intent. Rosie didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her blade flashing in the dim light. The creature hissed, striking at her with lightning speed, but she moved like a shadow, her body a blur of lethal precision. James joined the fray, his axe cleaving into the creature's side with a satisfying crunch. The fight was brutal, every second a battle for survival. The creature's venom sprayed across the walls, sizzling as it ate through the pulsating material. Rosie's movements were poetry in motion, her strikes perfectly timed to exploit the creature's weaknesses. James fought with raw power, his attacks hammering the beast into submission. When the creature finally fell, its body collapsing into a pool of steaming ichor, James leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "Tell me that's the worst this maze has to offer." Rosie didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the path ahead, her expression grim. "It's not," she said finally. "The maze has more than one guardian." "Of course it does," James muttered. "Why make it easy?" They pressed on, the tension between them unspoken, but palpable. James couldn't shake the feeling that Rosie was holding something back, her earlier confidence tempered by an undercurrent of worry. He was about to ask when the maze began to shift again, the walls groaning as they closed in around them. "Run!" Rosie shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted through the narrowing passage, the sound of shifting stone and the hissing of unseen predators driving them onward. The maze seemed to take pleasure in their panic, its walls twisting and rearranging to confuse and disorient them. As they rounded a corner, the ground gave way beneath James. He barely had time to cry out before he was falling, the world tilting wildly. He hit the ground hard, pain flaring through his shoulder. Above him, Rosie's voice called out, her tone sharp with urgency. "James, are you—" Her voice was cut off as the walls closed between them, leaving him alone in the oppressive darkness. James pushed himself to his feet, wincing. The faint glow of the walls provided just enough light to see his surroundings. He was in a lower section of the maze, the air thick with the smell of decay. His pulse quickened as he heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. "Rosie," he called, his voice echoing. There was no response. The scraping grew louder, closer. James gripped his axe, his knuckles white. A pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by another set, and another. "Well, this just keeps getting better," he muttered, his voice tight. As the creatures emerged smaller than the earlier beast, but no less deadly, James steadied himself. He might have been scared, but he wasn't about to give up. He had a warrior princess counting on him, and for reasons he couldn't fully understand, that mattered more than his fear. The creatures lunged, and James charged to meet them, his axe swinging. Whatever this maze had in store, he wasn't going down without a fight. James's axe slammed into the final creature, the beast's shriek echoing through the labyrinth as it dissolved into ash. He stumbled back, panting, his muscles screaming in protest. He turned to see Rosie leap gracefully from a ledge above, landing beside him with the poise of a trained predator. Her blade dripped with iridescent ichor, the faint glow casting an otherworldly light on her fierce features. For a moment, they simply stood there, breathing heavily, their eyes locked. The maze seemed to sense their victory. The pulsating walls stopped shifting, and a faint, melodic hum filled the air. Ahead of them, the ground shimmered as an exit appeared, a glowing archway framed by swirling energy. "We made it," James muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Relief flooded through him, but his body remained tense, the adrenaline refusing to ebb just yet. "Don't celebrate too soon," Rosie warned, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. She moved closer, her sapphire eyes scanning his face. "You're bleeding." James glanced at his arm, realizing for the first time that a jagged cut ran along his bicep. "Guess I didn't notice in all the excitement," he said with a weak grin. Rosie stepped even closer, her expression softening in a way he hadn't seen before. "Let me." Before he could protest, she reached out, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. Her fingers brushed his skin as she examined the wound, her movements uncharacteristically tender. "It's shallow," she said, her voice quieter now. "You'll be fine." James nodded, unable to look away from her. The fierce warrior who had chosen him as her champion now stood inches away, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. The charged atmosphere of the labyrinth seemed to follow them through the archway, and as they stepped into the open air, the tension between them shifted, deepened. The exit led to a secluded glade, the alien sky above awash with hues of pink and gold. Strange, luminous flowers glowed softly around them, their light casting an almost dreamlike quality over the scene. For the first time since the tournament began, the silence felt calming rather than oppressive. Rosie turned to him, her sapphire eyes searching his face. "You fought well," she said, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic warmth. "Better than I expected." James chuckled, the sound easing some of the tension in his chest. "High praise, coming from you." Her lips quirked into a smile, but there was something different in her gaze now, something vulnerable. She took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. "James, do you understand what the bond eternal truly means?" He hesitated, the intensity of her gaze rooting him in place. "You said it's a connection, mind, body, soul. But what does that really mean?" Rosie exhaled softly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It means that we're more than just partners in battle. It means that every part of who we are becomes entwined. Every thought, every feeling, every desire." Her words sent a ripple through him, a mix of awe and trepidation. "And you're okay with that? Tying yourself to someone like me?" She tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You're not what I expected, but maybe that's a good thing." James felt the heat of her presence, the magnetic pull between them growing stronger. He reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing hers. The contact was electric, sending a shockwave of sensation through his body. Rosie's breath hitched, her sapphire eyes widening slightly before softening. "Rosie," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't fully understand. "I don't know what this is, but it's not just the tournament, is it?" She shook her head slowly, her pink hair catching the light. "It's not." The tension snapped, giving way to something raw and undeniable. Rosie stepped closer, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest. James leaned down, their faces mere inches apart. Her breath was warm against his skin, her scent a heady mix of battle and something uniquely her. When their lips met, it was like the world around them disappeared. The kiss was fierce, unrestrained, a culmination of everything they'd endured together. James felt the fire in her, the strength that made her a warrior, but also the vulnerability she had so carefully guarded. It ignited something primal in him, a need to protect her, to stand beside her not just as her champion, but as her equal. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the cool air, Rosie's eyes held a rare softness. "The bond isn't complete yet," she murmured, "but it's beginning. I can feel it." James nodded, his heart pounding. "Then let's make sure we win this thing. Together." Rosie's smile returned, this time full of fire and determination. "Together," she agreed. As the stars above shimmered like a million watchful eyes, the bond between them deepened. No longer just a requirement of the tournament, but a connection forged in fire, trust, and something far more profound. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment, they knew they were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other. The tranquil glade was short-lived. As soon as Rosie and James began to let the weight of their bond settle, the air around them crackled with ominous energy. The glowing flowers dimmed, their light fading into an unnatural blackness. James instinctively tightened his grip on Rosie's hand, his instincts flaring with unease. "What now?" he muttered, scanning their surroundings. The warmth of their moment together was quickly replaced by a chilling tension. Rosie's sapphire eyes darkened as she drew her blade, the ethereal hum of its power cutting through the silence. "It's not over. The tournament doesn't allow for rest, not when the stakes are this high." Before James could ask what she meant, the earth beneath them quaked violently. A jagged rift tore through the ground, splitting the glade in two. The rupture unleashed an inky black mist that slithered into the air, its tendrils coiling and twisting as if alive. James coughed, the acrid smell stinging his throat. Out of the mist emerged figures, shadowy beings that defied logic. Their forms were fluid, constantly shifting, their eyes glowing like embers. They radiated an aura of malice, their movements unnervingly silent. "What are those?" James asked, his voice edged with panic. "Specters of the rift," Rosie said grimly. "They feed on doubt, fear, and hesitation. If you let them into your mind, they'll tear you apart from the inside." James gritted his teeth, gripping his axe tightly. "Great. So, no pressure." The specters advanced, their shapeless forms drifting closer. Rosie stepped in front of James, her blade glowing brighter as she steadied herself. "Stay focused," she said sharply. "If they sense weakness, we're done." The first specter lunged, its shadowy form expanding like a net. Rosie met it head-on, her blade slicing through its body with a flash of light. The creature let out an otherworldly screech before dissipating into smoke. James wasn't so lucky. Another specter darted toward him, faster than he could react. Its tendrils wrapped around his arm, cold and suffocating. A flood of images invaded his mind, visions of his failures, his deepest fears, the lives he couldn't save. His grip on the axe faltered, his knees buckling. "James!" Rosie's voice cut through the haze. She darted toward him, her blade severing the specter's tendrils in a burst of light. The creature recoiled, retreating into the mist. "Snap out of it!" she shouted, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "They're trying to break you. Don't let them in." James blinked, her voice grounding him. The shadows receded from his vision, and he forced himself to focus on Rosie's fierce, determined gaze. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was shaky. "I've got this." "Good," Rosie said, releasing him, "because there are more coming." The mist thickened, the specters multiplying. They swarmed around them, their movements erratic and disorienting. James fought alongside Rosie, their bond pushing them to move in unison. Her precision complemented his brute strength, their attacks carving through the shadows with relentless force. But the specters were relentless. For every one they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The mist grew heavier, its oppressive weight seeping into their minds. James felt his focus slipping, the haunting whispers of the specters gnawing at his resolve. "You're not strong enough," the shadows seemed to hiss. "She'll leave you. You'll fail her." He shook his head, trying to drown out the voices, but they were relentless. His movements slowed, and a specter took advantage, striking him across the chest. Pain flared, and he stumbled back, his axe slipping from his grasp. Rosie was at his side in an instant, her blade slicing through the specter before it could finish him. "James, focus!" she barked, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. "I can't do this alone." Her words cut through the fog in his mind, reigniting his determination. He grabbed his axe, pushing himself to his feet. "I'm not letting them win," he growled. They fought harder, their attacks fueled by a shared will to survive. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The specters grew weaker, their forms less solid. James felt the whispers in his mind fade, replaced by the fierce bond he shared with Rosie. Together, they carved through the remaining creatures, their final strikes leaving the mist eerily still. The rift began to close, its edges knitting together as the last of the specters dissolved. The glade returned to its serene state, but the air remained heavy with tension. Rosie turned to James, her expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "You hesitated," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "If I hadn't been there—" "I know," James interrupted, his voice rough. "I let them get to me. I won't let it happen again." She studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "You fought well," she said quietly, "but the rift tests more than skill. It reveals the cracks in your resolve. You need to face those, James, or they'll destroy you." James nodded, her words sinking deep. He reached out, brushing a strand of pink hair from her face. "I'll fight through it," he said, "because I'm not letting you down. Not now, not ever." For the first time, Rosie didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her hand on his. a silent acknowledgement of the bond growing between them. But as the stars above shimmered ominously, James couldn't shake the feeling that the rift was only a taste of the challenges to come, and that their connection would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The air in the glade grew colder, the tranquility giving way to an oppressive silence. Rosie and James barely had time to catch their breath before the ground rumbled beneath their feet. A jagged crack split the earth ahead, and from its depths rose a towering figure cloaked in shadows. Its body was humanoid, but impossibly large, its skin an amalgam of obsidian and molten light. A pair of fiery eyes burned like twin suns, boring into them with ancient malice. Rosie's stance shifted immediately, her blade raised. "The Warden of the Rift," she said, her voice steady but grim. "I was afraid this would happen." "Warden?" James asked, his fingers tightening around the axe. "What does it want?" "To judge us," Rosie replied. "It guards the next stage of the tournament. Only those it deems worthy can pass, and it won't make that decision lightly." James stepped forward, his jaw set. "Great. Another oversized monstrosity to hack apart." Rosie shook her head, her pink hair catching the faint light. "This isn't a simple fight, James. The Warden is a being of pure energy and will. It can sense our weaknesses, our fears. If we falter, it won't hesitate to exploit them." As if to prove her point, the Warden raised a massive hand, and a ripple of energy pulsed through the air. James felt an invisible weight press down on him, his muscles locking, as the creature's voice boomed in his mind. "You dare to stand before me?" it thundered. "Show me your resolve, your strength, your truth. Only then will you earn the right to continue." The air shimmered, and suddenly, the Warden split into two identical forms, each radiating overwhelming power. One turned its burning gaze on Rosie, the other on James. "Separate trials," Rosie said, her knuckles whitening as she tightened her grip on her blade. "Don't lose focus. Trust yourself." Before James could respond, the Warden's clone raised a hand, and he was enveloped in darkness. James blinked, finding himself standing in a void that felt both infinite and suffocating. The air was thick with tension, and the faint echo of his own thoughts surrounded him. "You cannot hide from yourself, human," the Warden's voice boomed. "Show me your worth. Show me who you truly are." Suddenly, the void shifted, and James was no longer alone. He stood in the ruins of a battlefield, broken weapons and shattered armor strewn across the ground. At the center lay Rosie, her body crumpled and lifeless, her blade shattered beside her. "No!" James shouted, rushing to her side. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he touched her shoulder. Her skin was cold, her sapphire eyes staring blankly into the void. "Is this what you fear?" the Warden's voice asked, echoing around him. "That you will fail her? That your strength will not be enough?" James clenched his jaw, his heart hammering. "I won't let this happen," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "This isn't real." "Is it not?" the Warden countered. The battlefield dissolved, replaced by a vision of Rosie standing before him, her expression cold and distant. "Why should I trust you?" the vision demanded. "You're weak, reckless, a liability. I should have chosen someone stronger." The words cut deep, but James forced himself to stand tall. "That's not her," he said firmly. "She wouldn't say that. This is just another trick." The vision smirked, but James ignored it, focusing on the truth he felt deep in his soul. "Rosie chose me," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm willing to fight. For her. For us. And I won't let anything not you, not my fears get in the way." The void trembled, and the vision shattered like glass. The Warden's voice returned, quieter now. "You speak with conviction. Perhaps you are worthy after all." James was thrust back into the glade, his chest heaving. Across from him, Rosie stood, her blade glowing faintly. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Did you—" he began, but she nodded before he could finish. "The Warden showed me my own doubts," she said quietly. "My fear of failing, of trusting the wrong person. But it's over now." James stepped closer, his gaze steady. And I was right to trust you," she said, a faint smile curving her lips. Before they could say more, the Warden reappeared, its two forms merging back into one. It towered over them, its fiery gaze assessing them once more. "You have proven yourselves worthy," it said, its voice resonating with finality. "But the path ahead grows darker still. Prepare yourselves, champions, The true test has yet to come. With a deafening roar, the Warden vanished, leaving Rosie and James standing alone under the alien sky. The stars above seemed dimmer now, the weight of the tournament pressing heavier than ever. Rosie turned to James, her sapphire eyes fierce. "We survived this," she said. "But the Warden's right. The real challenge is still ahead." James nodded, determination burning in his chest. "Then let's face it. Together." The Warden's warning lingered in the air as James and Rosie pushed forward. The final stage of the tournament loomed, a massive arena carved into the heart of a crystalline mountain. The jagged walls shimmered like starlight, and the ground beneath their feet hummed with latent energy. Above them, a swirling vortex of fire and ice tore through the alien sky, casting the battlefield in an eerie, shifting light. Rosie stepped forward, her blade drawn, her stance unyielding. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "The grand challenge." James hefted his axe, his honey-colored eyes scanning the arena. "What are we up against?" As if in response, the ground shook violently. The vortex above descended, its fiery tendrils coalescing into a massive, otherworldly form. A monstrous being emerged, its body forged from molten rock and ice, its eyes blazing with elemental fury. It towered over them, a living storm of fire and frost. "That," Rosie said grimly. The crowd, unseen but ever-present, erupted into a deafening roar. The voice of the arena boomed across the battlefield. "Champions of the bond eternal, face your final test. Conquer the fury of elements or perish." Rosie glanced at James, her sapphire eyes fierce. "This isn't just about skill," she said. "It's about us. If we're going to win, we have to trust each other completely." James nodded, the gravity of her words settling over him. "We've made it this far. I trust you, Rosie, with everything I've got." Her lips curved into a small, determined smile. "Then, let's end this." The fury roared, its massive claws crashing into the ground. The impact sent shockwaves rippling across the arena, forcing James and Rosie to leap aside. The battle began in a whirlwind of chaos and destruction, the elemental beast unleashing waves of fire and ice that threatened to consume them. Rosie moved with deadly precision, her blades slicing through the air as she danced around the creature's attacks. James matched her ferocity, his axe swinging in powerful arcs that sent shards of molten rock flying. Together, they were a seamless force, their movements synchronized as though guided by an unspoken connection. But the fury was relentless. Its attacks grew more vicious, its body regenerating with every strike. James felt his strength waning, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. "Rosie!" he shouted, dodging a torrent of fire. "We need to hit it where it's weakest." She nodded, her eyes narrowing. "The core," she said, gesturing to the glowing sphere at the center of the beast's chest. "But we'll only get one shot." James grinned, adrenaline surging through him. "Then let's make it count." They charged together, weaving through the Fury's attacks with desperate precision. Rosie leaped onto the creature's back, her blade plunging into its molten flesh. It howled in pain, its movements faltering. Seizing the opportunity, James hurled his axe with all his strength, the weapon spinning through the air and striking the core, dead center. The Fury let out a deafening roar as its body began to fracture, light pouring from the cracks. Rosie leaped clear just as the creature exploded in a blinding burst of energy. When the light faded, the arena was silent, the Fury reduced to nothing but glowing embers. The voice of the arena returned, triumphant and resonant. "Champions of the bond eternal, you have conquered the grand challenge. Your victory is absolute. The bond eternal is yours." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a thunderous wave of celebration. James turned to Rosie, his chest heaving, his heart pounding. She stood bathed in the light of their triumph, her blue skin glowing, her sapphire eyes filled with something deeper than victory. "It's over," she said softly, stepping toward him. "We did it," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. Together. Rosie smiled, and for the first time, her walls fell completely. She leaned into him, her lips finding his, in a kiss that was fierce and unrestrained. It wasn't just a celebration of their victory, it was a promise, unspoken, but undeniable. That evening, the arena transformed into a grand hall, its crystalline walls glittering like diamonds. A ball was held in their honor, the alien sky above, alive with vibrant lights and music that resonated with the heartbeat of the stars. Rosie was radiant, dressed in a flowing gown of silver and sapphire that seemed to shift with every movement. Her pink hair was adorned with delicate, crystalline pins, and her sapphire eyes sparkled with joy. James stood beside her, his rugged frame clad in elegant armor, polished to a mirror shine. As they moved through the hall, surrounded by admirers and well-wishers, James couldn't take his eyes off her. "You look incredible," he said, his voice low. Rosie smiled, her fingers brushing his. "So do you. Though I'd still take you with an axe in hand." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I'll keep it handy just in case." The music shifted to a slower melody, and Rosie extended her hand. "Dance with me?" James took her hand, his heart pounding as they stepped onto the dance floor. They moved together effortlessly, the connection between them stronger than ever. As the music swelled, James pulled her closer, his gaze locked on hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "Not just the tournament, but you." Rosie's smile softened, her hand resting against his chest. "Neither did I. But now that I have you, I'm not letting go." Under the shimmering lights of the grand hall, surrounded by a world that had tested them to their limits, they shared a moment that was entirely their own. Their bond, forged in fire and battle, had become something far greater, an unbreakable connection of love and trust that would guide them into whatever future awaited. For James and Rosie, the tournament was over, but their journey together was only beginning. The night lingered like a dream, the alien sky shimmering with the light of countless stars. James and Rosie stood on a balcony overlooking the crystalline peaks of the tournament's arena, the cool breeze brushing against them. Below, the sounds of celebration continued, a symphony of victory and joy. Rosie leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her sapphire eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you feel it?" she murmured, her voice soft but certain. James wrapped an arm around her, his hand resting on the curve of her waist. "Feel what?" "The bond," she replied, turning to look at him. Her gaze was filled with a warmth that made his heart race. "It's not just a connection, it's a promise. One I never thought I'd find." James smiled, his honey-colored eyes meeting hers. "I feel it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's like you're a part of me now, in a way I can't explain, and I don't want it any other way." Rosie's lips curved into a soft smile, and she reached up to touch his face, her fingers brushing his jawline. "Neither do I." They stood there in silence for a moment, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. The trials they had faced, the dangers they had overcome, all of it had led them to this. And now, there was only love, fierce and unyielding, binding them together in a way that nothing could break. "You know," James said, a teasing glint in his eyes, "if you had told me a week ago I'd fall in love with an alien warrior princess in the middle of a cosmic death tournament, I'd have called you crazy." Rosie chuckled, the sound rich and melodic. "And if you'd told me my champion would be a reckless Earthling who somehow captured my heart, I'd have said the same." He leaned down, their foreheads touching, his voice a whisper. "But here we are, and I wouldn't change a thing," Rosie replied, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Not for all the stars in the universe." As the celebrations faded into the night, James and Rosie remained on the balcony, wrapped in each other's arms. Their love burned brightly, an eternal flame forged in the crucible of the tournament, unshakable and infinite. Together, they faced a future unknown, their hearts entwined as one. For James and Rosie, the bond eternal was not just a victory, it was their destiny. And in that moment, they knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything,